Okay, so this is our last lecture and last discussion on the Protestant Reformation. And now we're going to look at the Catholic response. Now, one must remember that the Protestant Reformation had only limited success. Now, the two most powerful monarchies in Europe, both Spain, located down here, both Spain and France, also in this area right here, remained Catholic, as did Austria. So over here, Austria, and this is Austria right over here in this area, as did Austria, as did, where else did I say? Hungary, Poland, parts of Germany. So you can see pretty much all of this area and this area kind of still, and this area right here, remained still highly Catholic. So it wasn't everywhere. So Protestantism didn't spread everywhere. Still, the Protestant success had been rapid and posed a serious threat to the Catholic Church, and as a result, the Church went through its own Catholic Reformation, also known as the Counter-Reformation, to obviously counter stuff that was happening with Protestantism, to figure out how to fix the problems. Now, in doing so, it reformed itself, defined its theology, and reestablished the Pope's authority in the now reduced Church, and prepared for a counter-offensive against the Protestants. Right, so the Church had often been challenged with criticism in the past, but each time had patched things up with internal reforms. Therefore, at first it saw Protestantism as just another protest that a few reformers could mend, and failed to recognize the deep philosophical and religious issues that were involved. Now, since many church abuses were the result of the financial problems deeply rooted in the later Middle Ages, maybe it was too much to expect reforms of abuses at this time. However, those problems only got worse in the 1500s. Now, inflation, loss of lands and revenue to the Protestants, and invasions of papal lands left Pope Paul III with only 40% of the revenues his predecessor had just 10 years earlier. And as difficult as it would be, the threat of further losses to the Protestants made reforms all the more necessary. And in 1536, Pope Paul III, established a fact-finding commission to find out why there was so much protest and what could be done about it. And the resulting report, Advice on the Reform of the Church, blamed the Church for many of its problems and called for reforms that would convince the Protestants to rejoin the Church. Now, two things resulted from this report. First, the Church failed to accept responsibility. So they failed to accept responsibility, which is a rather big deal if you think about it. They failed to accept responsibility and for its problems, making that new reforms that result only half-hearted, and consequently, Protestantism kept expanding. The second result was that the Church, rather than trying to reform itself, decided to attack its enemies. So attack enemies was its second one. So instead of trying to fix itself, it tried to attack its enemies. And in 1542, the Pope brought the Inquisition into Italy. So this is an important part here. The Inquisition came into Italy, giving the Inquisitor general authority over all Italians. Now, this effectively uprooted any elements of Protestantism in Italy and restored the Pope's authority over the whole peninsula. And to a large extent, the Inquisition helped put an end to the Italian Renaissance, since it suppressed Italy's vigorous intellectual life for the sake of conformity to the Church. Now, remarkable individuals, such as Galileo, might still come along, but they would face the Inquisition's repression for any new ideas they might propose. Now, the Church was also waking up to the dangers that a free press presented to established order. And in 1543, the Inquisition published the first Index of Prohibited Books. So the Index of Prohibited Books. And like I had said, this was published in 1543. The Inquisition published this, the first full-scale effort to limit or destroy the free expression of ideas through the press. and it would not be the last. Now, among its victims was the report, Advice on the Reform of the Church, since it was seen as giving solace to the Protestants and their ideas. So they just banned their own book as part of this index. Now, however, by the 1540s, it was becoming increasingly apparent that the Catholic Church would have to institute serious reforms if it were to halt the rising tide of Protestantism. And these reforms came from two directions: the papacy at the top and the grassroots or popular level from below. So let's begin with the reform from the top. Now, one problem facing the church was the wide variety of interpretations people had of the Bible and other church writings. Now, this was not a new problem, but it became an urgent one when faced with competing Protestant interpretations. Consequently, Pope Paul III called a General Church Council that met at Trent, Italy, to decisively define decisively what the official doctrines of the church were. They met at the Council of Trent from 1543 off and on until 1563. It wasn't 20 straight years, but they were kind of meet here and there. Now, people remembered the threat to the Pope's power that councils had posed during the Great Schism a century earlier, and naturally the Pope was nervous about this and tried to restrict the council to working on church doctrines instead of reforms that might threaten his position. So it met in 3 sessions from 1543 to 1563, this Council of Trent. Popular hopes focused on the desire to restore Christian unity, so restore unity was very important because Protestantism had, in essence, disrupted the unity of Christianity. Even since representatives were supposed to attend but never did. They were going to try to bring the Protestants in with the Catholics to figure this out. Now, even if it did not achieve such unity, the council did revitalize the Catholic Church and restored the Pope's power within the Church. So a restoration of the Pope's power, which is one of the things Luther was arguing against, and say it was Calvin and others were arguing that the authority lies in the Bible, and this is the church saying, no, the Pope is the most powerful here on earth, and everything comes from him. It also strictly defined religious doctrine. So the doctrine that was brought up here, and I'll list the things here that it did. It emphasized both the role of faith and good works. So against what Martin Luther was arguing against, so faith and good works, very important, in achieving salvation. And it declared the Latin Vulgate Bible the only acceptable form of Scripture. So the Latin Vulgate, or Vulgate. This is basically the Bible written in Latin, and they said that all other form of Scripture, vernacular, were not included in this. They excluded any vernacular translations. It also reaffirmed the validity of the sacraments, all 7 of them, whereas Luther argued that only two were very important. The Catholics reaffirmed the idea that there were 7 sacraments. Oops, too far back. 7 sacraments that were the most important, and they continued doing those. It kept the elaborate ritual and decoration of the church, since they were inspirational for the mass of illiterate Catholics with little or no understanding of church dogma. And it also enacted various reforms. So some reforms that it enacted ensured that clergy were better educated. So better educated clergy. It's pretty important. Martin Luther kind of argued that as well as the Pope was even able to restore his authority over local church and clergy at the king's expense. Now, although the Council of Trent did not peacefully restore Christian unity, it did reestablish the authority of the popes within the Catholic Church, giving it the power to launch an offensive against the Protestants to reclaim formerly Catholic lands. Also restoring the church spirit was a new religious order, the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. So the Jesuits, like I said, are the Society of Jesus is the other name, the official name, but we usually refer to them as the Jesuits. They were founded by Ignatius Loyola, and he lived from 1491 to 1556. And he was quite similar to Luther in how he achieved interreligious peace, although the two men arrived at some very different conclusions about their respective faiths. Loyola was born in Spain. He was a Spanish noble, and like Luther, had no initial plans for a religious career, being a soldier by profession. Also, like Luther, a somewhat dramatic event turned his life to religion. So write down he was a noble and a soldier. So unlike Martin Luther, who was first a lawyer from a middle-class society, from a family of lawyers, and then became a monk. Now, instead of lightning striking Loyola, it was a leg broken by a cannonball while defending a fort that forced him into a long period of convalescence and ultimate conversion. Now, instead of the tales of war and chivalry that Loyola liked, the only reading material available was religious in nature. Now, eventually this literature had its effect. Loyola experienced an intense conversion and decided to devote his life to Christ. Now, like Luther, Loyola almost killed himself trying to purge his guilt. He finally obtained some inner peace by deciding the devil was responsible for any self-doubts and despair one had for sins, and he had already confessed to the church and done penance for. Now, Loyola developed a 4-week-long set of spiritual exercises, which helped others achieve similar inner peace. These exercises first had people contemplate their sins and their eternal consequences in hell for 2 weeks, then contemplate Christ's life, sacrifice on the cross, and resurrection for a week, and finally contemplate the final ascension into heaven. Now, after a pilgrimage to Palestine, Ignatius decided to get an education in order to preach more effectively. Now, in school, he gathered a loyal core of followers, the most famous being this guy by the name of Francis Xavier. And in 1536, they went to Rome determined to win souls, not by the Inquisition or the sword, but by education. So this was how you would win souls according to the Jesuits. Education was very important. And especially the young who were most impressionable. Now in 1540, this is when they started the Society of Jesus. So here we are in 1540 now. Also known as the Jesuits. Now the order was organized along military lines with 4 ranks or classes. So this is kind of militaristic Catholicism. In terms of organization, mostly Catholicism. More militaristic Catholicism. Members were expected to show absolute obedience to their superiors, the Pope, and God. Now, instead of ascetic activities such as endless praying and whipping themselves, the Jesuits performed Loyola's spiritual exercise and menial labor. Discipline was rigorous but flexible, helping the Jesuits produce some remarkable leaders. Now, the Jesuits also carefully selected their target audience from 2 main groups in society. So their target included the nobles and children. The nobles and children. 2 groups of people that were really targeted here. As the confessors for royalty and nobles, they exercised considerable influence on religious policies within Catholic states. And they also ran numerous schools, believing that if they could influence children at an early age, they would remain loyal Catholics for the rest of their lives. Now, the order grew rapidly and became the virtual shock troops of the Catholic Church, and they had missionary activities to South America, still mostly Catholic, and Asia. Within Europe, they spearheaded the Catholic Reformation by strengthening the Church's power in areas it still held while restoring allegiance in such areas as Bohemia and parts of Germany. Now, with their church on much firmer ground than before, many Catholics felt ready to go on the offensive against Protestantism. Now, what resulted was a series of religious wars that would engulf Western and Central Europe for the next century. And the most notable of these that you can do in your reading is the 30 Years' War. All right, so this is the end of this lecture on the Counter-Reformation. Thank you for listening.